They say Thanksgiving is about gratitude. For me, it was the day my son decided I wasn't his father anymore. I woke up that morning to the sound of the desert wind brushing against the window screens, the kind of dry whisper only Arizona knows how to make. The sunlight slid across the floorboards, lighting up the old photo of Margaret on the mantel. She'd been gone 7 years, and yet every morning she greeted me from that frame, smiling like she was still alive somewhere, probably scolding me for leaving my coffee pot running again. I started the day as usual, fed the neighbor's cat through the fence, tightened the loose hinge on the back gate, trimmed the overgrown cactus that had started leaning toward the driveway. At 65, my knees weren't what they used to be, but I liked the ache it reminded me I was still capable. After half a lifetime working for the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office, I'd learned that quiet mornings were a kind of luxury only earned after years of noise. The neighborhood was calm, flags already hung on porches for the long weekend. The air smelled faintly of mesquite smoke and someone's early attempt at turkey. Across the street, Ellen, the widow who never missed a HOA meeting, waved from her front steps. She had a pie in one hand and a gossip magazine in the other. I waved back, pretending not to notice she was already spying on who parked in front of whose house. Inside, my house still felt half alive and half memory. Margaret's favorite quilt hung over the couch. Her old ceramic turkey, chipped but still proud, sat on the table. I'd invited David and Melissa over for dinner later that evening. It had been months since they'd come by. David's texts had grown shorter. Melissa's tone had turned colder. Something in the way they said, "We'll see, Dad," always carried an edge, as if gratitude was a bill I still owed them. I brewed coffee, strong and black. The smell filled the kitchen, covering the faint scent of dust and old wood. My phone buzzed a text from David. "We'll be there around 6. Melissa's parents might swing by for dessert if that's okay." I stared at the message for a while. Might swing by. No question mark. Just a statement, like they'd already decided. I typed back a short, "Let's talk about it later." Then I turned the phone face down on the counter. By noon, the sun had softened, and the neighborhood children were tossing footballs in the street. I stood on my porch with a small glass of bourbon, watching them. I remember doing the same with David when he was 10, him laughing every time he overthrew the ball, me pretending to chase it like a linebacker. Back then, the world was simpler. He'd call me Coach, and I'd call him Champ. Somewhere between then and now, we'd lost those names. Around mid-afternoon, Ellen came over with a fresh pie. "You shouldn't spend Thanksgiving alone, Richard," she said, handing it to me. "Even if your son's coming, that boy never eats dessert." I chuckled. "You're too observant for your own good, Ellen." Occupational hazard of living across from a prosecutor. She winked and left me with the smell of cinnamon and the faint sound of her slippers shuffling back across the street. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I set the dining table, nothing fancy, just the old oak one Margaret had chosen years ago. I ironed a clean shirt, poured another small drink, and turned on the radio. Sinatra's voice filled the living room, that same melancholy tone that makes you think of everything you gained and everything you lost. That night was supposed to be simple, just a quiet Thanksgiving dinner between a father, his son, and the woman who married him. I'd even set the table the way Margaret used to, with her old blue tablecloth and the cracked ceramic turkey she loved so much. It was my way of pretending things were still normal. But the silence at that table was louder than any argument. Melissa was the first to break it, swirling her wine, her red nails gleaming under the chandelier. "You know, Richard," she began in that smooth tone she used when she wanted something, "Mom and Dad have been thinking about moving down here. The weather's easier on their joints, and well, you have all this space." I didn't look up right away. I just kept carving the turkey. Years in court had taught me the power of silence. People always rush to fill it, and they reveal themselves in the process. David cleared his throat. "Yeah, Dad, their place up north isn't working out. They could stay here for a few months, maybe, just until they find something." There it was, the ask, wrapped in politeness. I set the knife down, finally meeting their eyes. "My house," I said quietly, "is not a motel for strangers." The sentence came out calm, almost gentle, but in the space between words, I could feel the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Melissa blinked, as if she hadn't heard me right. "Strangers?" she repeated, her smile frozen in place. "You're joking, right?" "I'm not." Her laugh was sharp, brittle, like glass about to break. "You're serious. You're actually serious. They're my parents." "I know who they are," I said, cutting a piece of turkey and setting it aside. "That's exactly why I said no." David shifted in his seat. He wasn't looking at me anymore, just at his plate. "Dad, it's just temporary. You've got all that space." I interrupted him. 4 years, David. 4 years you've lived here. No rent, no bills. Do you even know how much property tax costs in Scottsdale?" He didn't answer. Melissa's eyes narrowed, her voice rising an octave. "So this is about money? You think because you paid for everything, you get to decide who's family?" "No," I said softly. "I think because I paid for everything, I get to decide who lives in my house." Her fork hit the table with a clang. "You're unbelievable. I've met men in court who were less selfish than you." "I prosecuted men in court who lied for less," I replied. The tension thickened. The smell of gravy and roasted herbs hung in the air, turning heavy, nauseating. Even the old wall clock seemed to tick louder, mocking the silence between each word. Melissa leaned back, crossing her arms. "You know what, Richard? Maybe Margaret was the only decent one in this family." That one landed deep. I felt it in my chest, like a knife slipping between ribs. For a moment, I said nothing. The prosecutor in me was gone. Only the widower remained. But before I could speak, David muttered, "Melissa, stop." She cut him off, eyes still locked on me. "No, he needs to hear it. Maybe that's why David never visits, because you drive people away." I stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping against the tile. "I'm not doing this," I said, voice low. "Not tonight." Melissa reached for her cup, hand trembling just enough to give her away. "Fine," she said. "Then here's to you, Richard Hale, perfect prosecutor, perfect father." The hot coffee left her hand before I saw it coming. It hit my chest like fire. I heard myself gasp, felt the sting through my shirt, the smell of bitter roast filling my nose. David jumped up. "Melissa!" But she wasn't finished. "You're not family anymore. You never were." David turned toward me, pale and shaking. "Dad, she didn't mean." I raised a hand. "Don't," I said. Not a word. Melissa grabbed her purse and stormed out. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. David hesitated a moment, caught between two worlds, then followed her. And just like that, the house went quiet again. I stood there, dripping coffee onto the floor, staring at the empty chairs. The turkey sat untouched, the candles flickered low, and on the old radio, a gospel singer was crooning Amazing Grace. I almost laughed at the irony. I walked to the sink, ran cold water over the burn. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, lined, tired, like a man watching the last piece of his life drift away. When blood turns against you, you call the one man who still remembers who you are. I dried my hands and reached for the phone. Alan answered on the second ring. "You were right," I said quietly. "Start the plan." He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't have to. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning, we start with the paperwork. Just breathe tonight." "Breathe," I repeated. "That's about all I can do." Morning came quietly, with that pale Arizona sunlight creeping through the blinds. I didn't sleep. I doubt anyone could after something like that. The house still smelled faintly of burnt coffee and roasted turkey, a mix of bitterness and memory. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, ironic, I know, and stood at the kitchen window watching the desert wake up. The street was still. Ellen's flag fluttered lazily across the road. A jogger passed by with his golden retriever. It was the same peaceful scene as always, but inside me, something had shifted like a door had shut for good. Alan arrived around 9, punctual as ever. He drove the same silver Toyota he'd had since the recession, practical down to the last bolt. He walked in without waiting for me to open the door. That's how brothers are. We skip the pleasantries when the hurt is real. He took one look at my face and sighed. "You look like you slept in a courtroom." "Didn't sleep anywhere," I said. "Coffee's fresh." "Smells like evidence," he joked, then saw the burn mark on my shirt. His tone changed. "She did that?" I nodded once. He muttered something under his breath, then opened his briefcase. All right, let's do this the right way. I brought some forms, property verification, ownership affidavit, tax records. You've got the deeds, right? I motioned toward the garage. Everything's there. Margaret used to call it my museum of paperwork. Thanks for a watch. We stepped into the garage, my sanctuary, filled with the scent of oil, dust, and old memories. The sunlight cut through the small window, landing on stacks of neatly labeled boxes. Taxes, insurance, bills, house. I'd kept every receipt, every bank slip, every bit of paper that proved I built this life with my own hands. Alan adjusted his glasses and started sorting. You've been paying every bill since you retired, huh? Every damn one. He nodded approvingly. That helps. Legally, David and Melissa are tenants at will. No lease, no rent, no rights beyond courtesy. Once we send the eviction notice, the clock starts ticking 5 days. I ran a hand through my hair. It's not the papers, Alan. It's him, my son. I keep thinking there's something I could have done different. Alan closed the folder slowly. You raised him to know better. You can't fix a man who trades his backbone for convenience. His words sat heavy in the air. Outside, a lawnmower started up, cutting through the silence like a saw. He continued. Once we file, you might hear from him. Tears, apologies, maybe threats. Don't answer. Let me handle everything. You just keep records, calls, messages, anything he says. I nodded. You're expecting trouble? I've been a lawyer long enough to know family turns nasty when property's involved. We worked through the rest of the morning. Alan spread the documents across my old workbench, marking sections with yellow tabs. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, like a man building a case brick by brick. At one point, he looked up. You still have that joint account with him? Closed it last year. He said he'd manage his own money. Alan smirked faintly. Good. He'll find out soon enough that managing means paying. By noon, the sunlight had turned harsh. We took a break, sat on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. Ellen waved again from across the street. Alan leaned toward me and whispered, She's still sweet on you. I gave a small laugh. She's sweet on everyone who mows their lawn. The humor faded fast. My thoughts drifted back to the night before, the look on David's face as he followed her out, caught between guilt and loyalty. I couldn't shake it. Do you think he'll come around? I asked quietly. Alan studied me. Maybe someday. But right now, he's under her spell. People like Melissa, they know how to feed pride and starve conscience. I didn't argue. He was right. When Alan left, I went back into the garage. The air was still warm from the morning sun. I sat on the old stool and opened a small metal box where I kept personal notes, old case summaries, letters from Margaret, a few family photos. One picture caught my eye. David, age 10, holding a baseball glove too big for his hand. He was smiling, all teeth and sunlight. I'd taken that picture at the park near Papago. Back then, he'd looked at me like I was the world. I ran my thumb over the photo's edge until it started to crease. Where did you go, kid? I whispered. The doorbell rang. It startled me enough to drop the photo. I walked back inside, half expecting David. Instead, it was Ellen, holding a pie. I heard some yelling last night, she said gently. Just wanted to make sure you're okay. I'm fine, Ellen. Just family stuff. She frowned. Family shouldn't make you bleed, Richard. I smiled weakly. Sometimes they do. She handed me the pie and squeezed my arm. Well, if you need company, you know where I am. You can't fight the world on an empty stomach. After she left, I put the pie on the counter, but couldn't bring myself to eat it. My appetite was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. That evening, I called Alan again. I've been thinking, I said. Let's not just evict them. Let's make sure they can't come back. Thanks for watching. End quote. He hesitated. You mean a restraining clause? Whatever it takes. They used my kindness as leverage. That ends now. There was pride in his voice when he answered. You sound like the man I used to know in court. Maybe that man never left, I said. Maybe he just forgot who he was. After we hung up, I went through the house one more time. Locked every door, double-checked every window. I even replaced the key under the fake rock near the porch. David had known about it for years. That thought came to me one gray morning as I sat in Alan's downtown office, a cup of bitter coffee cooling on the desk between us. The place smelled of paper and air conditioning, sterile, professional, emotionless, just like the work we were about to do. Alan stood by the filing cabinet, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. "We'll treat this like any other eviction," he said. "No emotions, just the law." I nodded, though we both knew that was impossible. The law was my life once, but this time it was personal. Every page we signed, every document we filed, felt like driving another nail between me and the boy I'd raised. The folder on the table grew thicker as the morning dragged on. Property deeds, insurance statements, 4 years' worth of utility bills, all in my name. David hadn't paid a cent. The evidence was overwhelming, but instead of satisfaction, I felt a slow ache building in my chest. Alan leaned over a spreadsheet, tapping it with his pen. "See here? He listed your home address on a car loan last year. That's fraud by misrepresentation, technically." I rubbed my temple. He probably didn't think I'd notice. "Well, now you have, and Melissa's name appears on a joint credit account. Did you authorize that?" I frowned. "No, Margaret and I had that card years ago. It must have been still active." Alan looked up sharply. "She's been using your card, Richard." I exhaled, long and slow. "Of course she has." We said nothing for a while. The ticking of the office clock filled the silence. When we finally gathered everything into a neat pile, Alan pulled out a yellow envelope stamped certified mail. "This is the eviction notice," he said, sliding it toward me. "Once they receive it, they have 5 days to vacate. I'll file it with the court clerk at Maricopa County this afternoon." I stared at the envelope for a long time before signing my name. The pen scratched across the paper, firm but trembling. Alan watched me. "You're doing the right thing, Rich. It's not vengeance. It's order." I gave him a thin smile. That's what I used to tell victims when I took their statements. It never made them feel better. By afternoon, the sun was cutting hard against the glass windows. We drove together to the courthouse, the same building I'd walked through thousands of times in my career. The marble lobby smelled faintly of bleach and old air. As we passed through security, one of the guards, an older man who used to nod at me every morning, blinked in surprise. "Mr. Hale, haven't seen you in years." "Good to see you, Tom," I said. "Just paperwork today." He grinned. "Once a prosecutor, always a prosecutor." I didn't have the heart to tell him that this time the case was against my own blood. We filed the notice, stamped and official. On the way back, Alan handed me a copy. "Keep this somewhere safe. You'll need it when the sheriff delivers it." I folded it carefully, like it was a fragile relic instead of a weapon. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows back home. I sat at my desk, reading through everything, each line another reminder of how far my son had fallen. The phone rang once, then twice. When I finally picked up, Alan's voice was quiet but firm. "They've been served." The silence that followed was heavier than I expected. "Thanks," I said, my voice dry. "I guess that's that." "Not quite," Alan replied. "Now we wait." The waiting didn't last long. 2 days later, my phone began buzzing non-stop messages, notifications, and missed calls. When I checked Facebook, my stomach turned. Melissa had posted a long rant, public for the world to see. "Some people grow old and bitter. My father-in-law is one of them. He's kicking us out of the home we've lived in for years, even though we took care of him. He's losing his mind, and instead of helping, he's throwing his own family onto the street." Hundreds of comments followed, some from people I'd never met, some from faces I half recognized from the neighborhood. Sympathy emojis, hearts, angry faces. People loved a scandal, especially one dressed in family tragedy. I scrolled through, my hands trembling. One comment read, "Typical old man syndrome, hoards money, forgets love." Another said, "Didn't he used to work for the prosecutor's office? Guess karma's catching up." I closed the app, but it was too late. The poison was already out there. By evening, my old landline rang, the one I rarely used. A familiar voice came through. "Richard?" It was Paul Benson, a retired colleague from the prosecutor's office. We'd tried our first case together 25 years ago. "Paul," I said, forcing calm. He hesitated. I saw something online." "Is it true? Are you Evicting your own son? The question hit me harder than Melissa's coffee ever had. I'm enforcing my rights, I said quietly. Paul sighed. I'm not judging, Rich. I just never thought I'd see your name on social media like that. Neither did I. After he hung up, I sat there in the half-dark, staring at the framed certificate on the wall. Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office, 1989, 2018. My name used to stand for something. I'd spent decades fighting for justice, for victims, for truth, and now I was the headline of a family soap opera. Once, my name stood for justice in this town. Now it's trending on social media. I poured a glass of bourbon, but it didn't taste the same. Nothing did anymore. Outside, the porch light flickered Ellen's signal. She always left it blinking when she wanted to talk. I debated ignoring it, then grabbed my jacket and walked across the street. She was waiting on her porch swing, a cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, a newspaper folded neatly on her lap. I figured you might need some fresh air, she said. I sat down beside her, the swing creaking softly. You've heard, I assume. Everyone's heard, she replied gently. But hearing isn't knowing. She reached into the newspaper and pulled out a printed copy of Melissa's Facebook post. People forget quickly, she said, tapping the paper. But paper doesn't. Keep this. You'll need it one day. I took it from her, speechless. Ellen, I said finally, you don't owe me this. Maybe not, but you've always waved at me from that porch, even when the rest of the neighborhood pretended I was invisible after my husband left. I remember who you are, Richard, not what they're saying. Her words cracked something inside me. I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. She smiled faintly. Now go home before you catch cold, and for heaven's sake stop reading Facebook. As I walked back across the street, the wind carried the smell of her apple pie cooling on the windowsill. For a brief moment, I felt something close to warmth, not from forgiveness, but from knowing that truth still had witnesses. The next morning, the Arizona sun cut through the blinds like a blade. My phone was still buzzing on the nightstand. Messages, notifications, missed calls, all unwanted noise. I muted it and sat up slowly, every joint in my body reminding me of my age. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the floor. It's strange how silence can scream louder than any argument. Downstairs, the kitchen was still half clean from the chaos of the past week. I made coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the small breakfast table. That table used to hold Sunday pancakes and laughter. Now it was a war room. I spread Ellen's printed page beside the eviction documents. The headline from Melissa's post looked different on paper, colder, somehow. The lies were the same, but printed words carried weight. Ellen was right. People forget, but paper doesn't. When Alan arrived later that morning, he didn't bother with greetings. He dropped his briefcase on the table and said, "We've got movement." Already? Melissa's post is getting attention. Some lawyer friend of hers commented publicly that you might be mentally unfit. She's planting the seed for a guardianship claim. I clenched my fists. She's trying to get control of my estate. Alan nodded grimly. Exactly. We need to get ahead of that narrative. I've already drafted a statement for the court medical clearance, financial records, proof of mental competency. We'll file them with the eviction papers. He handed me a pen. Sign these. We'll notarize everything. As I signed, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. I used to stand on the other side of this desk, Alan the man defending the truth. Now I'm the old fool everyone doubts. Alan met my eyes. Then remind them who you are. He started scanning through my files again, tax records, insurance, social security documents. He pointed to one page. See this? David changed the mailing address for your property tax notices last year. They've been going to his P.O. box. A pulse of anger hit me hard enough to make my hands tremble. He's been intercepting my mail. Likely. We'll subpoena the bank and postal service if we have to. The thought made me sick, not the legal mess, but the betrayal behind it. David knew my routines, my weak spots, my trust. He'd weaponized them. Alan slid a form across the table. We'll request the certified property ledger. Once it's stamped, that's irrefutable evidence. I nodded mechanically, signing where he pointed. He paused, looking at me. You okay? I stared out the window, where sunlight danced on the gravel yard. You ever wake up and realize you raised a stranger? Alan didn't answer. He didn't need to. By late afternoon, we were back at the Maricopa County Courthouse the second time that week. The clerk recognized us this time and nodded politely. Papers shuffled, stamps clacked, signatures flowed. Everything was by the book. When we stepped outside, the sun was low, turning the courthouse facade gold. Alan exhaled. It's official now. 5 days. After that, the sheriff handles it. I looked back at the building. Its white stone columns glowed in the fading light. Once upon a time, I'd sworn oaths in there, argued cases, believed that justice was a clean thing. Now I knew better. Justice was never clean, it was just necessary. That evening, when I returned home, a car I didn't recognize was parked across the street. Silver, newer model, tinted windows. I watched it for a while before it finally drove off. Inside the mailbox was a plain envelope. No return address. I tore it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of printer paper, a screenshot of Melissa's Facebook post, now edited to include a photo of me on my porch, caught mid-blink. Below it, someone had written in black marker, "You should be ashamed." I stood there for a long time, the paper shaking slightly in my hand. Shame, funny word. After everything I'd seen in courtrooms, theft, lies, violence, I thought I'd lost the ability to feel it. But this was different. This was personal humiliation, the kind that seeps into your bones. I crumpled the paper and threw it into the trash. But my hand hovered there. No evidence was evidence. I smoothed it out again, flattened the wrinkles, and placed it in a folder labeled defamation. If they wanted a war of reputation, I'd fight that too. 2 nights later, I received another call, this time from the sheriff's office. "Mr. Hale," the deputy said, "we've scheduled the property inspection for verification. You'll need to be home tomorrow morning." "Of course," I said. "Expect some noise. Eviction cases always stir up neighbors." He wasn't wrong. The next morning, I heard them before I saw them, David and Melissa, shouting from the driveway as the deputy pinned the notice to the door. Melissa's voice carried like a siren. "This is abuse. He's senile. You can't do this to family." The deputy ignored her, calm and procedural. "You've been served. You have 5 days to vacate." David's face turned red. "You'll regret this, Dad," he hissed. "You think you're still some hotshot prosecutor? You're just a lonely old man nobody believes anymore." I met his eyes. "Then maybe you should stop giving them reasons not to." But he frowned no. For a second, something flickered in his face, maybe shame, maybe hatred, then it was gone. He turned and stormed off, Melissa dragging behind him. The deputy nodded respectfully. "Tough situation, sir. I've handled worse," I said, though my voice cracked slightly. When they drove away, the neighborhood fell quiet again. I stood by the mailbox, feeling the weight of every year I'd lived here, every holiday, every barbecue, every morning jog past the same houses. And now, I was the scandal of the block. Ellen came over again, holding a brown envelope. "They dropped this in my box by mistake," she said. Inside was a printed screenshot, another one of Melissa's posts. This time, she'd attached a photo of the sheriff's notice, captioned, "Look what my father-in-law is doing to us. He's completely lost it." Ellen's face was calm, but her eyes burned. "You going to let them write your story, Richard?" "No," I said. "I'm going to write it myself." Facting that. That night, I stayed up at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of paper. Tax forms, credit statements, mortgage records, photos, years of my life stacked in folders. I opened a new binder and labeled it carefully in block letters. Case file. Hale v. Hale. Page by page, I filled it every detail, every lie, every transaction. My handwriting shook at first, but steadied as I went. Somewhere between grief and fury, I found focus again. At midnight, I turned off the light and stood by the window. Across the street, Ellen's porch light blinked once her silent goodnight. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like peace. Not joy, not even hope, just a sense that maybe, just maybe, truth still had a fighting chance. It was a quiet Sunday morning when David came back. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something ugly to happen. The Arizona air was crisp, dry, and uncomfortably clean, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I was trimming the mesquite tree by the driveway when I saw his car pull up. A silver sedan, dust-streaked, parked crooked near the curb. He stepped out in a pressed shirt, trying too hard to look respectable. No Melissa this time. Just him. "Dad," he called, his voice small against the open sky. I didn't answer. I just kept trimming. It wasn't pettiness, it was control. When you've been humiliated enough, silence becomes the only weapon that doesn't cut your own hands. He came closer. "Can we talk? Please." The please didn't sound right. It didn't sound like regret, it sounded rehearsed. I put down the clippers, wiped my hands on my jeans. "You've said enough for a lifetime, David. What else could there be?" He looked at the ground, then back at me, eyes wide with what I can only call strategy. "I just want to fix things. For both of us. Thanks for watching." "Fix things," I repeated, the words dry in my mouth. "You mean like how you fixed my reputation on Facebook?" He winced. "I didn't know she'd post all that. I told her to take it down." "Did she?" He hesitated. "Eventually." I sighed. "You didn't come here to apologize. You came here because something isn't going your way. So go ahead, say it." He swallowed hard and reached into his messenger bag. Out came a thick manila envelope. He laid it on the patio table between us like a peace offering or a trap. "I've been talking to some people," he began, "about making things simpler for you. Managing bills, taxes, paperwork. You shouldn't have to deal with all that anymore." I opened the envelope. Inside were a few neatly typed pages, legal formatting, notarization lines, blank signature boxes. My eyes scanned the header. Power of attorney. My stomach turned cold. I looked up at him, searching his face for hesitation, anything human. This is a power of attorney?" He nodded quickly, trying to sound professional. "It's standard, Dad. Everyone does it when they get older. It just gives me authority to handle things for you. In case I what, David?" My voice rose, just enough to make him blink. "In case I lose my mind? In case I forget my name? Dad, don't twist this. It's for your own good. You've been under stress." I pushed the papers back toward him. "Stress doesn't make me stupid." The mask on his face cracked a little, revealing something colder underneath desperation. "You're making this harder than it has to be? I'm trying to help you. Help me." I stepped closer, my voice steady but low. "You came for my house. Now you come for my name. For my mind." He flinched, his jaw tightening. "You're being paranoid. Have us by." "No, I'm being thorough like you used to see when I built a case." I pointed to the signature line. "Who drafted this? Melissa?" He froze for a moment, then said, "A friend. From church." "Of course. A friend. There's always a friend." I leaned over the table, my shadow falling across the papers. "You think you can trick a man who spent 40 years reading lies for a living? You think I wouldn't spot a guardianship clause buried in fine print?" David's face went pale. His lips trembled, but no sound came. "Take your envelope," I said quietly, "and get off my property." "Dad, now." He hesitated, then reached for the papers, his hands shaking. As he turned to leave, he muttered, "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. I just followed him to the door, opened it, and waited until he stepped outside. Then I shut it, slowly. The lock clicked once, twice, echoing through the house like a verdict. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the brass doorknob, feeling the tremor in my hand. When I pulled the key from the lock, it slipped and fell, clinking against the hardwood floor. I bent down, picked it up, and stayed crouched there longer than I should have. The house felt too big, too quiet. There's a kind of stillness that feels sacred, and then there's the kind that feels like defeat. The morning of the hearing arrived like Judgment Day. The air in downtown Phoenix was heavy with heat, even though it wasn't yet noon. The courthouse, the same one I'd walked through hundreds of times as a prosecutor, now loomed over me like something out of a bad dream. It's a strange thing, walking into a place where you once commanded respect, only to return as a man being questioned. Alan met me on the courthouse steps. He was dressed in a gray suit, crisp and composed as ever, holding a briefcase full of documents, my life condensed into labeled folders. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," I said. We walked through the metal detectors together, the same route I'd taken decades ago when I fought for justice on behalf of strangers. Now, I was fighting for my own name. Inside courtroom 3B, the air conditioning hummed too loudly. Melissa was there, of course, in a modest blue dress that screamed innocent. David sat beside her, eyes down, jaw clenched. He couldn't meet my gaze. For once, I was glad. Judge Martinez presided calm, unreadable, the kind of man who didn't tolerate drama. I'd argued cases before him years ago. I could only wonder if he remembered. When the bailiff called my name, I rose without a lawyer. Alan sat quietly in the back row, ready if I faltered, but this was my battle to fight. The judge adjusted his glasses. Mr. Hale, I understand you're representing yourself. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I've done this before, though never quite like this. A faint smirk flickered across his face. Let's proceed. Melissa stood first, all tears and trembling hands. Your Honor, she began. This man threw us out like trash. After all we've done for him, taking care of his home, keeping him company, he turned on us. Her voice quivered at just the right moments. It was almost impressive. Judge Martinez nodded patiently. You'll have time to present evidence, Mrs. Hale. For now, let's keep statements brief. Then it was my turn. I stood, hands steady on the table. Your Honor, for 4 years, my son and his wife have lived in my house rent-free. They have not paid property tax, utilities, or insurance. Every document in this folder, I held it up, is proof of that. Every bill, every receipt, every signature. I walked toward the clerk and handed her the folder. The sound of paper against wood was sharper than I expected, like punctuation. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. David's leg bounced under the table. I continued. They claim to have cared for me. Yet here are the hospital records, no visits. The repairs they handled, paid by me. Their groceries, charged to my credit card. Even their vacations to Flagstaff and Sedona, all booked using my address for travel rewards. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Melissa's tears stopped cold. Judge Martinez looked up. Do you have bank records to support this? Yes, Your Honor. Exhibit B. Alan rose quietly from the back and walked forward to hand the copies to the clerk. For a moment, our eyes met. He gave the faintest nod, the kind you give when the truth finally stands taller than the lie. Melissa's lawyer, a young man in an ill-fitting suit, cleared his throat. Your Honor, with all due respect, Mr. Hale's memory may not be entirely reliable. Stress can cause confusion at his age. That was the spark. I looked him dead in the eye. Counselor, I may be 65, but I remember every name of every man I ever sent to prison. I remember every file number of every case I ever closed. And I remember very clearly the day my son decided to sell his father's dignity for convenience. The room went still. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. Judge Martinez tapped his pen, then spoke. Mr. Hale, please stay on topic. Yes, Your Honor. Topic is all I've got left. Alan tried to hide a smile behind his hand. Melissa's lawyer fumbled through his notes, avoiding my gaze. We have no further comment. Judge Martinez leaned forward. I've reviewed the documents. There's no question about ownership. The deed is solely under Mr. Hale's name, and all supporting financials are consistent. There is no indication of mental incapacity. People distracted buildings. He picked up the gavel, heavy, deliberate. The property belongs solely to Mr. Hale, he said clearly. The defendants must vacate within 5 days. Case closed. The gavel struck wood. Thud. That sound, sharp, final, felt like a door slamming somewhere deep inside me. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Just the quiet confirmation that I hadn't lost my mind. Melissa gasped, whispering something furious to David. But I didn't hear it. My focus blurred. The years of disappointment. The weight of love turned bitter. It all collapsed into silence. David stood slowly, eyes glassy. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Then he turned and left, Melissa clutching his arm. I remained standing. Judge Martinez gathered his files and paused. Mr. Hale, he said gently, I remember when you prosecuted that fraud case in 2003. You taught this court that the law isn't about punishment, it's about clarity. I hope today brings you some. I nodded, my throat tight. It does, Your Honor. It truly does. Outside, the sun hit my face like an open hand. I blinked against the brightness, breathing deep for the first time in weeks. Alan joined me on the steps, tucking his sunglasses into his pocket. "It's over," he said. "Not quite," I replied. "They'll still talk. They'll twist it." The morning they came to move out was colder than usual for Arizona. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. I stood on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the moving truck crawl up the street like a slow confession. 2 sheriff deputies followed behind in a patrol car, their lights silent but their presence heavy. The neighborhood had gathered, of course pretending to check their mail or sweep their driveways. But really, they were here for the show. David stepped out first, looking smaller than I remembered. Melissa followed, sunglasses on even though the sun hadn't fully broken through the clouds. She moved like someone walking into a courtroom, chin up, eyes hard, ready to perform. The deputies handed me a nod, then went about their duty. One approached David, speaking softly, professional and detached. David nodded mechanically. Melissa crossed her arms, jaw tight. "You don't have to stand there and watch," Alan murmured beside me. He'd come early, like he always did, a silent pillar. "I do," I said. "If I turn away now, it'll feel like I've learned nothing." Boxes started coming out, one by one. Furniture I'd bought, lamps Margaret had chosen years ago, even the old rocking chair from the den. Every scrape of wood on the porch floor sounded like an accusation. Melissa barked something at one of the movers, her voice sharp, brittle. David tried to calm her, but his tone was weak. He looked over at me, eyes full of something between shame and plea. "Dad," he said, voice cracking, "please, we have nowhere else to go." I didn't move. "You had a home, David. You just wanted it to be yours before its time." He took a shaky step forward. "I messed up, okay?" Melissa pushed me. I thought, "Don't," I interrupted. "You thought you could use the law to erase what was left of me. You didn't just steal from me, you stole my peace." He opened his mouth again, but no words came. Melissa snapped, her mask finally cracking. "You think this makes you noble? You're just an old bitter man. No wonder your wife died miserable." The deputies froze. Alan stepped forward, but I raised a hand. I looked straight at her. "You're right," I said evenly. "I am old. I am bitter. But at least I'm still standing in my own house." She turned away, muttering something venomous. But it didn't matter anymore. When the last box was loaded, David lingered on the steps. He looked exhausted, not from moving, but from the weight of his own choices. "I never meant to hurt you," he whispered. I stared at him for a long moment, then said the only words left between us. "You're no longer my son." His shoulders collapsed. He looked at me like a drowning man watching the shore drift away. Then he turned, climbed into the truck, and shut the door. As the engine started, Melissa yelled something, maybe a curse, maybe a goodbye. I didn't care enough to listen. When the truck rolled down the street, the silence that followed was strange, not empty, but clean, like the air after a long storm. Alan stood beside me, hands in his pockets. "It's done." "No," I said quietly. "It's over. There's a difference." We went inside. The house was half empty, echoes where laughter used to live. Margaret's portrait on the wall seemed to watch us both, her eyes soft, almost forgiving. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where all this had started. I took out my checkbook, wrote the numbers slowly, deliberately. $70,000, Arizona Elder Justice Fund. Alan watched in silence as I signed. "That's a lot to give away," he said softly. "It's not giving away," I replied. "It's paying it forward. Maybe it keeps someone else from ending up where I did." Later that afternoon, I drove into town and delivered the check in person. The office was in a modest building between a dentist's clinic and a thrift store. No big signs, no ceremony. Just a place where quiet battles were fought every day. A receptionist led me to a small room that smelled faintly of coffee and paperwork. Behind a desk sat an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She stood when I entered. "Mr. Hale," she said, extending her hand. "We received your message. I'm Ruth Bennett, director of the fund." Her handshake was firm, the kind you remember. I handed her the envelope. "This should cover a few fights," I said. She opened it, looked at the check, then back at me. "This is generous. May I ask, are you a victim?" I thought about that for a moment. The word victim felt too small, too helpless. No, I said, just someone who survived. She nodded slowly. That's the best kind of donor. We talked a while about the fund, about the seniors they'd helped escape financial abuse, about the lawyers who volunteered time to fight guardianship fraud. It felt like looking at a mirror of my own story, only spread across hundreds of others. When I left the office, the late afternoon sun was spilling gold across the parking lot. For the first time in months, I felt a kind of quiet satisfaction, not happiness, but relief. Justice hadn't healed me. It never does. But the bleeding had stopped. A few evenings later, the sky over Scottsdale burned the color of rust, that late desert hue you only get when the heat finally gives up for the night. I was on the porch again, bourbon in hand, watching the light fade over the saguaros. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel haunted. Just quiet. Alan's old pickup rolled into the driveway, the sound of gravel under his tires like a familiar song. He got out, carrying a manila folder under his arm. I didn't need to ask. I could tell from his face it wasn't small talk. "Evening," I said. He nodded, taking the chair beside me. "Evening. You got a minute?" I tipped my glass. "Always." He laid the folder down on the table between us, the corner of it brushing the condensation ring my drink had left behind. "I was doing a follow-up at the courthouse," he said. "Routine, just to make sure the eviction paperwork was all filed clean. But I found something else in the system." He opened the folder and slid out a few photocopied pages. My name was printed at the top, in bold type, "Petition for Conservatorship." I stared at it for a long time before touching it. "He actually filed it?" Alan nodded. 3 weeks before the dinner. They were setting the stage. Melissa filled out most of it, but David signed. She forged a few lines, your signature included. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried every ounce of betrayal in black ink. "She was planning to declare you mentally incompetent," Alan continued. "Once the court approved, they could have sold the house, drained your accounts, and you wouldn't have had a say. Thank you for watching." I laughed, low and bitter. "They almost had me, Alan. Not by force, but by law." He leaned back, looking out over the yard. "And you beat them at their own game." I swirled the bourbon, watched the ice melt into amber ripples. "Maybe. But winning doesn't bring back what they took." Alan didn't answer right away. The crickets had started their evening chorus, and somewhere down the street, a porch light flicked on. "I think," he said finally, "they took your trust, not your dignity. And you just proved you still have plenty of that left." I smiled faintly. "You always were the kinder brother." He shrugged. "You always were the stubborn one." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that doesn't come easy but feels good once it does. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The desert wind moved through the mesquite trees, carrying that dry, dusty scent of life hanging on. I thought about all the cases I'd tried, all the verdicts I'd heard, and how justice had always sounded like a gavel hitting wood. But now, I knew better. Justice isn't a sound. It's silence, the kind that comes after the noise has burned itself out. Alan stood, gathering his papers. "You'll be okay, you know. Might even sleep through the night again." "I doubt it," I said. "But maybe that's fine. The quiet's enough. I would never fight her." He squeezed my shoulder, that wordless, brotherly way, and walked to his truck. Before he climbed in, he looked back. "You know, Richard, I'm proud of you." That caught me off guard. "For what? Losing a son?" "No," he said softly. "For not losing yourself." He drove off, tail lights fading into the dusk. I stayed there a while longer, listening to the desert breathe. The cicadas, the faint hum of a passing plane, the creak of the old porch boards beneath my feet. The house no longer echoed with anger, just memory. Inside, the phone blinked with a voicemail, probably from the court or maybe from one of the neighbors who still didn't know what to say. I didn't play it. Instead, I walked into the den, to the framed photograph of Margaret on the mantel. Her smile hadn't changed, that same half-smirk that always said she knew more than she let on. I touched the frame lightly. "They tried to take everything, Maggie," I whispered. "But I still have your house, your garden, the truth." The bourbon was warm in my throat. The night settled deeper, and the air grew cool enough that I had to pull the old blanket from the chair and drape it over my knees. For a moment, I let myself drift to a memory years ago, when I'd stood in court against a man named Carson Weller. He'd forged his mother's will, sold her house, and smiled while doing it. I'd watched him crumble on the stand when confronted with his own handwriting. Back then, I thought punishment was the end of a story. Now, I knew better. It's just where you start learning again. Out in the distance, a train whistle blew long, low, lonely. I raised my glass toward the sound. "To lessons learned too late," I said quietly. Somewhere, Margaret might have smiled at that. I leaned back in the chair, the stars sharp and cold above the desert sky, and let the silence take me. On my 65th birthday, someone asked about my son. I told them I didn't have one. The air that day was golden, one of those Arizona afternoons when the sun feels less like fire and more like forgiveness. I had spent the morning trimming the mesquite trees and hosing the dust off the driveway, the kind of chores that make you feel grounded. Alan had insisted on throwing a small get-together. "Just a few people," he said. "You can't hide forever, big brother." "I know 5. By 4 o'clock, the porch was lit with soft amber bulbs, and the smell of bourbon and grilled steaks drifted through the backyard. Jazz played low from the old radio Chet Baker, smooth and lazy. I didn't realize how long it had been since my house sounded like music. The first to arrive was Ellen, the neighbor from across the street. She carried a pie in both hands, wrapped in a towel. "Apple cinnamon," she announced. "Still warm? I figured you wouldn't bake one yourself." "Not unless the oven comes with a legal clause," I joked. She laughed and set it on the table. "You look better, Richard, lighter somehow. Guess it's easier to breathe when the walls stop closing in." Soon, a few more familiar faces showed up, people from the old courthouse days, a retired judge, one of the secretaries who used to type my reports. They brought bottles of wine, laughter, and that gentle noise of age-slow footsteps, clinking glasses, and the occasional deep sigh between stories. Alan stood by the grill, tongs in hand, acting like he'd done this his whole life. "I should have gone into catering," he said, flipping a steak. "Please don't," I replied. "You'd cross-examine the customers." He grinned. "Old habits die hard." The talk was light travel, weather, who moved out of the neighborhood, who'd passed away. But underneath it all, there was that quiet awareness. Everyone knew what had happened. They just didn't know how to bring it up. When the food was served, I raised my glass. "To getting older," I said, "and still remembering how to enjoy it." The group laughed, glasses clinking. But for a moment, I caught Alan's eyes, steady, proud, and it struck me that this was what survival looked like. Not victory, not revenge. Just being here, still standing. Ellen cut the pie and passed me the first slice. "You ever think about moving?" she asked gently. "Start fresh somewhere quieter?" I shook my head. "This house is quiet now. Besides, I'd miss the sound of your lawnmower at 7 in the morning." She chuckled. "Fair enough." As the evening deepened, the golden light turned soft blue. Someone put on another record, Miles Davis this time, and conversation drifted into that comfortable rhythm old friends fall into when there's nothing left to prove. Then, somewhere between dessert and the last pour of bourbon, it happened. The retired judge, a tall man with more stories than hair, leaned back in his chair and asked it casually, as if he'd been holding it in the whole night. "So, Richard," he said, "how's David doing these days?" The words landed softly, but they echoed like a gunshot. The table fell silent. Even the radio seemed to fade. Alan froze mid-sip, eyes flicking toward me. Ellen looked down at her plate. I could have lied. Said he'd moved away, found a job, started over. That's what people expect. Tidy endings, family patched up, everyone hugging before credits roll. But life doesn't work that way. I looked at the judge, steady and calm. Then I smiled. "I don't have a son," I said. He blinked, confused. "Oh, I didn't mean to. It's all right," I cut in, still smiling. "You just reminded me how much lighter life feels without certain weights." A few awkward laughs followed, but the tension broke. Alan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You always did know how to deliver a line." The music swelled again. Ellen touched my shoulder as she passed. "You meant it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "I did, but not with hate." She studied me for a moment, then smiled. "That's the difference." We moved on to another topic, something about the new diner opening down the road. But inside, I felt that sentence still hanging in the air, like a verdict finally read out loud. When the guests left later that night, the porch lights dimmed, and the yard grew still. I walked Alan out to his truck. "You handled that well," he said. "Would have been easier if he'd asked about the weather." Alan smirked. "Yeah, but less honest." He got in the truck, paused with the door half open. "You ever think you'll talk to him again?" I thought for a long moment. Maybe someday, but if that day comes, it'll be his to start, not mine. He nodded once. "That's fair." As his truck disappeared down the street, I turned back toward the house. The porch was quiet again, the last notes of jazz fading into the night. I poured one last drink, raised it toward the stars. "To what's left," I whispered. And this time, it didn't sound sad. It sounded whole. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.